Hey everyone, I'm Stephanie, and I believe that all readers should read children's literature, especially adults. So that's what we do on the KidLit Love podcast. We celebrate all things children's literature, picture books, early readers, middle grade, and young adult novels too. Whether you're an adult reading to your inner child or connecting the young readers in your lives with fantastic books, you've come to the right place. Each week, we'll talk to a different children's literature author and discuss their books, their hopes and dreams for readers, their writing process, and much, much more. So, grab a notebook to build your TBR, and let's get to today's episode of KidLit Love. Hey everyone, welcome back to the KidLit Love podcast. I'm Stephanie, your KidLit loving host, inviting you to another weekly conversation with a children's literature author. Today, I'm talking with Naseem Hrab, an author whose books perfectly blend humor and heart. She's the author of the delightful Otis and Peanut series, How to Party Like a Snail, and The Sour Cherry Tree, along with others. Today, we're going to talk about her books and her writing and take a deeper dive into the Otis and Peanut series and her newest release. Naseem, welcome to the KidLit Love podcast. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
Me too. I love Otis and Peanut. It's a huggable book. It's the perfect size to hug and get comfortable with yourself or with kiddos. And I can't wait. I can't wait to chat about it. But before we dive into the books, let's start with you. Can you give listeners and readers a little background into you and your writing and your books?
Sure. So I am someone who has always wanted to write, and I never did. And well, I should say I never did it in earnest for quite some time until probably I was in my mid-30s. But all the while I was working in children's book publishing, watching other people make their books. So I was a bit of a frustrated artist for a period there. And it wasn't until I started taking improv classes again. It's something I had done when I was younger, that it really activated a part of my brain to help me learn how to tell stories. Because in improv classes, the teachers are constantly coaching you to kind of get to the story, and I use those tools that I gained from those classes to this day. And ever since that part of my brain activated in 2017, I haven't stopped writing, and it's been probably one of the best experiences for me personally. And I still work in children's publishing because you don't really make that much money as a children's author. We can talk about that too. Yeah, so I my day job is working for a children's book publisher, and then in my evenings or mornings I write, and it's kind of all children's books all the time for me.
Yeah, it's all encompassing then.
Mm.
All day, all night, all the time. I've got to tell you, the idea of improv scares the daylights out of me to have to think and do and come up with something on the spot. So my hat's off to you even more for not only writing books that I've loved, but being able to do that. Oh,
Yeah.
that is a skill.
I didn't say I was good at it, but yes, I do enjoy it as something to do. And yeah, it certainly pushes you to get out of your comfort zone and get out of your head and kind of just, say whatever pops into your head. So it's very useful for writing in the sense of stopping yourself from self-censoring as you write.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how did you go from there to, okay, this reignited something I want to do. I want to stop watching other people do the thing I want to do. How did that translate to your first book? Where did the idea come from? Or how did you just decide that's it? I'm doing
Yeah.
it.
Well, so a few of my friends in publishing at the time, we called it a super secret writing club. Uh, and yeah, we were kind of writing on the side. Now, I think only one of the people from that group has actual sort of writing aspirations. The rest of the group was writing for fun. But one of the pieces that I wrote for that group, two of the editors in the club thought this was publishable. So it kind of went from there. But the idea for that book, it was Ira Crumb Makes a Pretty Good Friend, was my own struggles growing up as a kid and trying too hard to make friends and kind of alienating people in the process of being way too enthusiastic and, a bit overbearing, let's say. So that came from a very personal place, that story. And it was one of those things where, he was supposed to be, I think, a Timbit, like, oh, I'm from Canada. A Timbit, it's like a donut hole. It's our,
Okay, thank you.
we have a coffee shop in Canada called Tim Hortons. I think there's some in the US, but we have, so he was kind of this little piece of cake. But one of the editors in the group was like, this is definitely a boy, like this has to be like a kid. And we went from there. But yeah, it started by kind of forcing myself to write every week. We did these weekly writing exercises that we were pretty committed, I have to say, for a few years. And we would work on monthly larger pieces, and that's where that story came from.
I love that. I've said on the podcast before, although I can't remember what episode, one of my favorite quotes is from Jim Rohn, and he says, "You are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with." And I'm always struck when authors say, "It was my group. It was my community. We were in it. We were pushing each other, and together you just kind of moved each other along."
Mhm.
I love hearing about that. It really is true of
Yeah.
who you surround yourself matters, and it just pushed you forward into this new piece of your life. I love it.
And no one gave up, to your point. Like, everyone was equally committed in it. And I think if we had kind of,
Yeah.
folks who weren't as committed, we all would have stopped, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, do you have pieces of you in all of your books? Because I know you said this first book, it was something based on you. How about the others?
Yeah, definitely. I'd say all of them. Otis and Peanut is particularly hilarious to me because a friend read the first one in front of me, and he said, "So it's both of you. Like, it's both sides of you." Otis, being particularly nervous and responsible, and Peanut being, more effervescent and enthusiastic. I vacillate between those two extremes myself. So yeah, and to go further in detail, like, one of the books that I've written is called Weekend Dad, about a little boy who's visiting his dad's new apartment after the parents get separated, is very much based on my experience when my parents got divorced as a kid. And then The Sour Cherry Tree, interestingly, as much as it is based on my experience growing up with having grandparents that don't share the same language as me, it's also about, my dad was a compulsive hoarder, and it's me rewriting the experience of walking through his house after he passed away. In The Sour Cherry Tree, the little girl walks through her grandfather's house after he passes away, remembering all her favorite things about him. And when my dad passed away, I walked through his house, which is the house I grew up in, and it was not what I knew or what I remembered. And I thought, well, what if I rewrote that experience if it was more pleasant? So that there's always going to be, I think, something in me, in my books. Yeah, whether it's really, really personal or, an emotion that I know very well.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you mentioned those other titles because I know we're talking about Otis and Peanut specifically today, but I did want to make sure we mention them, especially The Sour Cherry Tree. I loved that book. I loved it, and the illustrations just bring this level of emotion to reading it. So, listeners, even though we are not diving deep into that one, it is a favorite of mine. So I'm so glad that you mentioned it, and listeners, you need to pick that one up too. Okay.
Thank you.
So so now let's talk about Otis and Peanut, which is your series that we are kind of diving in deeper. So we've got 2 books so far in the series. We've got the original Otis and Peanut, and then we have the second that came out in April of this year, Otis and Peanut Forever and Ever. Can you talk a little bit about this really delightful series and these really two wonderful characters. And kind of what is it about? But what prompted you to write this too? Now that I know there's a little piece of you in all of them, I want to know where it is in Otis and Peanut too.
So the origin of these stories is very unlike most of the books that I've written. As I've kind of talked about, the other ones were all grounded in a reality for me. The first Otis and Peanut story came about, and I should add that this is it's a series of graphic novels, but each book contains 3 stories. And the first Otis and Peanut story, The Haircut, um, came about in a very unlikely way for me as a part of my process. I had offered to write a story for Chirp magazine, which again, I don't know if I think they're available internationally, but it's a Canadian magazine. There's Owl, Chirp, and Chickadee, and I had offered to write a story for them, and I just was trying to come up with ideas, and I thought of a little, long-haired guinea pig who needed a haircut, and his naked mole rat friend who didn't have hair but was encouraging him to get this haircut that he needed. And I didn't write the story. The due date was approaching very quickly, and I'm normally a very honest person, and I have no problem saying when I haven't done something on time. But for some reason, I wrote to the editor and I said, just need to make a few tweaks and I'll have this to you by Monday. I don't know why I did that, but I did that. And I had nothing. And the weekend passed and I still had nothing. And I wasn't panicking though, which was very strange. And Monday morning, I woke up at 6 a.m. and I'm not an early riser, I'm a terrible sleeper. And all of a sudden, this little story popped into my head. I wrote it down. I went back to sleep. And then I woke up at 8 and I sat down at my computer, and by 8:10 I had the first story. This
Oh my
doesn't happen to me. Like this, I never necessarily believed in like the muse or divine intervention, all these things, but I'm like, this was something divine. And I heard Stephen Wright, the comedian, he was asked about his writing process, whether he has to like sit down and write and have a designated time or if it's more organic. And he said, I'm my brain's receptionist. And with Otis and Peanut, I felt like I was my brain's receptionist. And I've heard authors talk about characters talking to them and like, having their stories, just sort of be transcribed. And that's what happened with Otis and Peanut. So it ended up that we also have a third one coming out in spring 2025 that's called Otis and Peanut Find a Way. And all these stories just came. So as far as, yes, these 2 characters go, you have the uber responsible Otis, and then the effervescent, more playful Peanut, who tries to get Otis to come out of his shell in most of the stories. Each book has a sad story in it, and in each book, that sad story is about their friend. Well, it's revealed in the second book, spoiler alert, that it's Otis's girlfriend, in fact, and Peanut's sister, who has passed away, Pearl. So Pearl is again based on a person in my life who I lost, actually the editor of Weekend Dad, and we don't reveal who Pearl is in the first book, which seems to upset some readers hilariously. I don't think kids are as phased at it, um, but it seems like people really like to know things and know them like very specifically. But I was like, well, that's not really life. Like you hear people talk
Right.
about people in and out of context, and you have to piece it together. All you need to know really is this Pearl is very important to them. But yeah, each story is grounded kind of in this childlike world, but they're adults, in my mind. But it's them dealing with kind of basic anxieties, pushing through that, and then this overarching kind of theme of sadness, which don't they sound wonderful based on that description? You definitely want to pick those up. But yeah, so that's kind of them in a nutshell, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, and they are wonderful. You're joking. Doesn't that sound wonderful?
Yeah.
These are I opened in the beginning of the episode, calling it the delightful
Mhm.
Otis and Peanut series because that is that is the feeling that I get when I look at it and when I read it. So these two characters, you've got the long-haired guinea pig, you have the naked mole rat, right? They are a little bit of an unlikely pairing
Mhm.
and they're adorable. This is very kid friendly, like I even as an adult I'm kind of leaning into the pages. But it's more than just a funny story. As you mentioned, there are all sorts of lessons. And in your books there are the 3 chapters, each or 3 sections, I guess if you will. Do you call them chapters?
I think we call them I don't know I know these are the things. Yeah, we to me they're stories, but yeah, we just call them contents. Like, yeah, like as a general but which I guess in hindsight is kind of confusing. Maybe we should have said 3 stories because I think people think they should connect, there's all these like kind of like
Right.
expectations people have with that kind of thing. But yeah, to me they were like Frog and Toad where it's
Yes.
just separate stories and each, they could
Yes.
stand alone or they're slightly connected in theme, but yeah. Yeah.
And that's what I was going to say. It has a frog and toad fun kind of a vibe. Each story is separate, yet it's still connected. It is the characters, and they're funny, yet still dealing with some big lessons. Like,
Mhm,
what do you do when you miss someone?
mhm, mhm,
How do you deal with things that kids deal with, right? But in an appropriate way. And I think as an adult, reading this book, those lessons are still just as important,
mhm,
if not more. This book kind of appeals to your inner child, if you will, that still might need some of these lessons.
mhm,
So in book 1, we've got the haircut, which I loved. I just loved that one right off the bat. We've got the swing, and we have the house. So lessons of missing people, lessons of friendship and what makes a house a home and all those wonderful things. But I've got to say, I think my favorite story is in book 2,
mhm.
the cake. So there's the cake, the
Yes.
team, and the collectors. And I have a sweet tooth, but I love the idea. And I know readers may not have read it, and I don't want to give away any spoilers, but it's this fun story that has this big lesson of, at least from my reading heart, like, what are we waiting for
Mhm, mhm,
to enjoy whatever we want to enjoy? Like, why do we have to have some big special reason to enjoy that cake? Um, I loved it. I just loved the whole idea behind it. And other big lesson that I took away too is that it's okay to hold 2 emotions at one time.
mhm,
They may conflict with each other, and that's okay. There's just so much bigness in this very delightful book, and I'm really curious of how you manage to both entertain
mhm.
and teach some really big things.
Luck. I don't know. It's a good question. One of the things that is unique about the making of these books, which I should add, and it doesn't answer your question, but I do wonder if it's part of how we were able to balance those two things, is that the books were all illustrated by Kelly Collier. And Kelly and I I've known her for years just through publishing, but we didn't start kind of collaborating with each other until I think 2020, 2021. And Owl Kids, who's the publisher of Otis and Peanut and How to Party Like a Snail, they allowed us to collaborate together directly, which is, if people don't know, is very rare in children's books.
I'm learning that. Yeah, that is kind of unheard of.
Yeah. And we kind of put it forward to them, not knowing if it would even work between us, but we just said, for How to Party Like a Snail, we're like, are you open to us collaborating? Because I was actually struggling. Unlike Otis and Peanut, that was not divinely delivered to me, and it was very, very mechanical and hard to write that book. But asked if we could collaborate. They said yes, and I'm like, if you don't like what we come up with, no problem. We'll backtrack or figure out something else, but we'd love to try. And now Kelly and I will have worked on 10 books together in that short period of time. Yeah, a bunch will, be coming out in the future, but um, so to kind of answer your question, I think part of the reason that we are able to balance the seriousness and the kind of, yeah, lessons with the fun is because our work together as far as the illustrations and the words is very tightly wound. So I'll write the stories, she'll draw, but then after that, we'll start being like, okay, I'm going to change this based on what you drew there. And oh, I'll change my illustrations again based on how you change the words. And we're really flexible. And I have no problem throwing stuff away. It took a while to get there, but you know what I mean? If I see another idea or I realize, oh, as much as I love that idea, it would be better if we changed it. I've gotten good at that. And Kelly is so open. She's so talented. She brings so much to every book, but I've never met someone who has so little ego. Like she's just so humble, hardworking, keen. Like it's really incredible. So it's been such like truly a dream come true and a gift to get to collaborate with someone like that. And I think that is also how we got there in a way. Yeah.
That back and forth, that together. It's almost like having, because you mentioned earlier, like which did you relate to more? Were you Otis or were you Peanut? And as I kind of agree with you, as I read it, I could almost see like Otis and Peanut on each shoulder. And it
Yeah.
sounds
Yeah.
like the two of you almost are like an Otis and a Peanut who are
Yeah.
working
Yeah.
together.
Kind of coaching myself in different ways. Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned that there is a third
Mhm.
Otis and Peanut in the works coming out spring 2025. So can we expect the same format? 3 stories?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that one has a very sad story, like again, a reassuring sad story, but it's I never know what's a spoiler or not, but it is Otis working through the fact that he thinks he's forgetting Pearl. And that her memory isn't as vivid, I guess, as it once was, and feeling guilty about that. Um, so and then yes, we have our fun stories in there as well. But yeah, that was uh again, it's all coming from a personal place, but that, when you have someone who's so important to you who you've lost, and then you realize you missed their birthday or, whatever those important milestones are for you with them. But yeah, it's funny because it's kind of like we've I want to say like candy coated what are really just very sad stories with books with stories on either side that make everything more happy. Because that's the thing, I never wanted to just be a downer. And I think right now, my sense of people is, readers and um is that they don't have their people are brittle right now, and I think even reading sad things can be hard. Um, so I think that what is nice about this format is that you're not left, on the downer. We bring you up at the end of each
Right.
book. Yeah.
Right. But the things that may be sad, we all experience and
Mhm, mhm.
kids experience. And so leaving them out of books doesn't necessarily help.
Yeah.
So I think including them, again, one of my big lessons was we can have and hold on to two different emotions, two
Mhm.
different conflicting emotions at the same time. And your books have that fun and the humor and the lightness and also a more serious, maybe I won't label it as sad. I'll say a real, and a serious element that reminds us that we all go through all of these different kinds of things, and yet we're all still in it together, just like Otis and Peanut.
Mhm, mhm. You should talk about my books. I
I would be happy to. So I know in addition to Otis and Peanut, you have a new book. Well, I guess it's a new book, but it also is kind of continuing, I guess you will, in a series of books coming out in fall 2024. Um, I also loved How to Party Like a Snail because if I had to party, I would want to do it like a snail too. wrapped up with my book, with my nice warm beverage, and maybe one close friend. So I so appreciate the theme, kind of the emphasis in those books. And so I'd love if you talk about your next book coming out. It still has that snail in there, which I'm so happy for. Go ahead and tell them the title and give a little snippet of what that's about.
Yeah, so the next snail book is called How to Staycation Like a Snail. And it's all about Snail and his best friend Stump, who is a tree stump rooted in the ground, going on a staycation. So Snail tries to travel, realizes maybe it's not for him, but finds that exploring his backyard, his glade, is just as fun and as exciting as a trip to a faraway place might be for other people. Because it was more a story about how adventure and new or exciting can be really found anywhere, and that just because someone maybe doesn't love to travel to far off places for whatever reason, they still might love exploration. So wanting to highlight that, it's funny because with the first snail, I have had so many friends identify with it, and then say about staycation, but I love to travel. Like, but not all of us do, and I do love to travel. I appreciate it. I feel very lucky to do it, but it also really stresses me out. So again, it's one of those things where it's very much based on my own personal experience. And we do have another snail coming out after this one called How to Be Brave Like a Snail, where a snail kind of needs to find the right words to express how he's feeling. It's fun. I have to say, it's so fun to get to revisit these characters, and same with Otis and Peanut. Like, I feel so lucky. I have some friends who write and illustrate children's books who have no interest in revisiting things and don't like the idea of series for their own, I guess, personal satisfaction. But I feel so lucky. Like, it is like connecting with old friends, and you kind of don't have to say goodbye. And um yeah, it's just such a nice thing to get to do, I think.
Yeah. I think as a reader, it's a
Mhm,
really nice thing to get to do
mhm,
too. As
mhm.
an educator, I primarily worked with students who were reluctant readers or who experienced difficulty at the beginning. And so they weren't sure if reading was their thing. And when they found a character that they liked,
Mhm,
when
mhm.
they found a format that they felt confident about, those series books, or at least books that were similar and had threads across, it boosted them up in so
Mhm.
many ways and was often the thing that tipped them into the I love to read
Right.
story. So I love seeing how it's grown. Did you know when you first, or maybe I should say, did you know or did you hope that Otis and Peanut and the Snail books were going to become series? Or was it just let me write the first one and then it was a happy surprise later on?
It's such a Yeah, that's a good question. I was just gonna say it's such a hard thing to, like, you can imagine it with certain books. The hard part, I guess, is the reality of the publishing of, like, if the first book does well, also they have to kind of put the second book into the list before the first book may even be out, so you don't know, and it's a risk for the publisher to kind of contract a bunch of books in a series without having that visibility. Um, so did I have when I wrote the first snail, I don't know that I thought it would be a series, but I think I thought I could write more. The snail feels pretty versatile. Otis and Peanut, Owl originally contracted 2, which was very lucky. And then a third happened sort of midway through that. Again, they took a risk without the visibility. They just believed in the characters, or believe in the characters so much. So all feeling very, like, lucky about it. Um, and again, getting to work with Kelly makes it that much more sweeter, to get to work on series. But yeah, I don't think I think because I know the reality from the publishing standpoint is that I never took for granted that I would get to make
Right.
these into series. Yeah.
That must be a hard dance sometimes, right? Going in blind has its drawbacks, right?
Yeah.
Of not knowing how the publishing industry works and what's involved. But so does probably knowing exactly how it works,
Mm.
which can be just as daunting. That must have been an interesting back and forth as you navigate both sides now.
Yeah, yeah, it is, and it's I wouldn't trade it for the world because I think that if I hadn't worked in publishing, for over a decade before I published, I would have had such, which a lot of people do, is just expectations that are wildly, out of control and not the reality. And but to your point, I now have like almost reduced expectations. Like it's like I don't even have like hope of something. I did it. I can't remember what it was precisely, but I did an event where I absolutely would have sold books had I thought of it, but I didn't because I was like, well, no one's going to buy them, so I'll just do the presentation and go. And I was like, oh my god, like I need to be more optimistic about the reality of the thing. That I could have sold some books there, but yeah, I think I have such uh maybe yeah, too realistic expectations of possibilities. And it's one of those things too where you see, certain authors and illustrators out of the gate, they have just this trajectory that it's they're the 1% of, unicorns in
Right.
children's publishing. And I'm like, oh, that that I only wish they knew the reality because there will be a fallow period, at some stage. And it's so hard to see so many authors, who have written, 40, 50 books, but no one knows their
Yeah.
name, so it's such a fascinating industry in that way. And that any award or any coverage may or may not lead to sales is the
Right.
bottom line. So there's no guarantees, but that's the fun of the lottery of it, I guess, is also the
Yeah.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And on this side of it, I think that's what I've loved so much about finally starting this podcast. So you mentioned it took, improv to get you to write. It took me a while to finally have the courage to start the podcast. And what I love is in this process, I have met so many authors that I wouldn't have known about because I wasn't digging as deep as I might have if I was just looking for a book to read. And I'm continually shocked by how many amazingly beautiful, gorgeous, heart-wrenching books
Mhm.
don't see as much light of day as others. There's just so many books in so little time, I guess.
Mhm. I think that's it. And what's interesting too, in say going back to Otis and Peanut for a moment, is that we've had interest. Like there's an Italian translation, there'll be Spanish and Catalan. It was the first book was recognized by the Bologna Ragazzi bookshelf. So not the official award, but it's kind of like 100 books were chosen to be part of its bookshelf of books that were innovative, kind of runners up, let's say. And I'm like, did we write a book that really appeals to a European sensibility? Because that it's just that part of it is interesting too. In my work at the children's book publisher that I work at will look at international books to see if we think they'll be a fit for North American market. And there's so much nuance in that as we look. And it can be one illustration that's off that we're like, oh, that won't fly in North America. And the book is otherwise, beautiful and amazing. And so that's a really interesting part of it too. Like, and I will say like the more you try to appeal to everyone, the less you appeal to anyone, because then you're just like, what are you doing? So it's just that part of things really fascinate me. Like that when we think, oh, this book's gonna hit, and then it doesn't, but then the book we think will probably do, as much as we believe in it, do okay, like knocks it out of the park. Like it's just kind of the fun of everything. But you're right. Ultimately, it comes down to there are so many books being made. Yeah.
So many, which is good. It's just we need a few more hours
Mhm.
a day in order to get to them all.
Yeah, for
But
sure.
good news for us, your books can be read and loved and enjoyed in a sitting. So
Yes,
everybody has time
that's
for a
true.
book like this, for your picture books, for the graphic novels. So where can listeners find you online, whether it's your website or social media to learn more about you and grab your books?
So I can be found on the web at Naseem Hrab, so my full name.com. I'm also on Instagram. My account is private, so that's not helpful, but I do add people. I was just trying to not have the I want to say fake doctors around the world add me to scam me. So so that's why that's private. It's not because I'm closed off. And I am on Twitter X, for now. But yeah, I can be found in all of those places. And I do love hearing. That's the thing I think people don't realize. It's like it's a very lonely life being a writer. I think unless you're, Dave Pilkey or someone of that stature, you don't often hear from your readers. So it is quite lovely to hear from people who have read the books, and I always respond. So that would be wonderful for this desperate author to hear any feedback. I'm open to it. But yeah, that's where you can find me.
Okay. Well, I'll make sure to put links to your website and Twitter. We can leave the Insta off so that you are keeping away from some of them. But if you want, we can have all of those links, and I'll also put links to the Otis and Peanut books. All of the books that we mentioned today on the episode will be in the show notes to make it easy for people to just click on it and grab them too.
Great. That's awesome.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for coming on and chatting. I loved it. And again, I think everybody has a couple of minutes to grab Otis and Peanut, or as an ode to the fellow introverts. You'll love the snail books as well. And I'm just so grateful you spent some time with us today. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And it's so meaningful to hear that you're enjoying these books. Because again, they're very close to my heart. So it is just so lovely to hear that someone also related to them. So thank you so much for this. It was really wonderful.
You're welcome. And listeners, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the KidLit Love podcast. And I will see you again next week. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the KidLit Love podcast. You'll find links to all the books, resources, and ideas mentioned in the show notes at alitlife.com. And if you want more, you might like to listen to my other podcast called Get Literate. It's a podcast that explores all things books and reading, notebooks and writing, and everything in between to build a life you love. One more thing. If you love what you listened to today, please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, or take a screenshot of the episode and text it to a bookish friend. This helps the podcast grow and builds our bookish community of KidLit Love. Thanks for listening.